Chapter 4 examines the cycle of sexual offending. The offending cycle includes not only the planning that goes into the offense, but also any cognitive processes used by the offender. Sexual offenses are rarely spontaneous, and with child sexual abuse in particular, there's usually what's referred to as grooming behavior. The offenses cycle describes the interaction of the offender's thoughts, feelings, and behavior. And so keep in mind that sexual abuse is a result of a series of multi-determinant decisions. Once begun, the offense cycle can continue because the sex offender can neutralize their feelings of guilt, shame, and responsibility through the use of cognitive distortions. So, prior to committing a sexual offense, offenders make a series of decisions. Some of these transpire after a long period of time, while others may occur pretty rapidly. It's important to understand that there are conditions that create a pro-offending environment, and it's also important to understand how certain events that occur, how certain antecedents to sexual offending vary amongst offenders. So offenders rarely make a straightforward decision to offend, but they make a series of decisions that together lead to the offending behavior. So sometimes this involves seemingly irrelevant decisions, and these create a pro-offending environment. For example, the decision to go to a bar. What these decisions do is they place offenders in environments in which they have access to potential victims through their routine activities. So the offense cycle consists of multiple determinants, and this is the interaction of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And they could be situational, so basically you're in a situation where offending is possible. They may involve negative affective states, depression, anger, or loneliness. They may be based on past learning. The offender may have been abused in a similar way. And the actions may be reinforced, so the pleasure derived from the act may reinforce that behavior. So first, the offender has negative thoughts. This may lead to self-pitying, which leads to negative feelings, which leads to negative behaviors. So those thoughts and feelings often lead the offender to make these seemingly irrelevant decisions that lead them to withdraw from others. Once they've withdrawn from others, this results in further loneliness and isolation. This then, in turn, results in a lack of communication that causes the original negative thoughts and feelings to go unresolved and further heightens the intimacy deficits of the offender. Once the offender is ensconced in the thought, feeling, behavior cycle, they begin to experience inappropriate sexual thoughts or fantasies. And these could be focused on a particular individual, or they may be abstract. These fantasies then may in turn lead to masturbation, from which the offender derives pleasure. That positive reinforcement then reduces the negative thoughts and feelings that are at the beginning of that behavioral cycle. This in turn then further reinforces the negative behavior. Then the offender begins to take steps towards the overtly deviant behavior. So that's the actual deviant behavior we're concerned about. He or she may then begin to plan the abusive act and groom the victim. And this abuse then in turn may lead to more negative feelings, which leads to the desistance of the abuse cycle. So when we think about grooming and planning, many people might not realize how much planning goes into a sexual offense. Child sex abusers in particular may have greater awareness of this because they groom their victims. So grooming a victim involves premeditated behavior that's intended to manipulate the potential victim into complying with sexual abuse. So with children, a lot of times what an offender will do is they'll start to engage in some seemingly innocuous behavior in which it would be with behaviors that would give them sort of permission to touch a child. And as the child then basically slowly eroding at the child's sense of this behavior is wrong. So this could be anything like taking a child swimming and then offering to help them with their swimsuit, tickling or wrestling. And many rapists don't even recognize the level of planning that they put into their offenses. Most of them would claim that this was like a spur-of-the-moment, instantaneous decision. So according to Pryor, grooming tactics are the seduction and teasing of the child. So sexual activity is initiated after a common interaction. As I mentioned, something like tickling or helping a child with a bath. And then what happens is they incrementally increase that behavior until the child says to stop. They may also engage in catching the victim by surprise. So perhaps they've been planning for some time, but no opportunity has occurred. So the offender may manipulate a situation so that they're alone with a victim or take advantage of an opportunity that presents itself. There could be verbal or physical coercion, but most abusers use manipulation. Few use physical force, weapons, or threats. They may also hide the sex or mask it in some type of context of a game, and this is used more by manipulative offenders who often have more than one victim. And then the most common tactic is, of course, emotional and verbal coercion. Bribes, lack of disciplinary action, emotional blackmail. And this is often used by incest offenders and those who have regular contact with the children that they're victimizing. So some offenders do not admit to initiating the contact. They'll instead claim that the victim initiated it. And Pryor refers to this as taking over from the victim. So basically the offender's arguing that they carried on with the behavior once the victim initiated it. In reality, of course, this is a distorted perception. So what about how offending behavior persists? Once that offense cycle has begun, the sex offender has to overcome any external or internal inhibitions to commit an offense. And so one of the ways that this happens is through what's called cognitive distortions. Many sex offenders may have fantasies about a victim, a particular victim, or certain practices. And the continuation of those fantasies is correlated to them maintaining that deviant behavior. And most of these fantasies focus on power and control. Some sexual abusers of children do fantasize about loving their victims, but most of this is really about power and control over someone else. Some will blame their behavior on external factors. So they're in a bad marriage, or they were consuming alcohol or drugs, or they're stressed. But remember that these are not causal. Okay, so they're not causing the offending behavior, but those are things that can be triggers for the offending behavior. Cognitive distortions are techniques of neutralization, and we talked about these in, well, those of you that have taken criminology are probably familiar with these. Sykes and Matza talks about them. It's basically a way that we neutralize feelings of guilt and shame when we break rules that we know we shouldn't be breaking. And everybody uses these, okay? Everybody justifies their bad behavior somehow as some sort of exception to the rule. What makes these cognitive distortions of sex offenders unique is their content. So it's unclear if they really do believe these ideas, or if these are simply, they're simply using them to justify their behavior. So some researchers suggest that they're self-serving, and so they're consciously distorting their thoughts initially, but perhaps over time they've convinced themselves that these things are true, and they may even come to believe them. The most common ones are minimization and or denial of the offense, lacking victim empathy, an inability to recognize the level of planning that went into their offenses, and sexual entitlement. So minimization and denial. Most offenders do this. They minimize or deny their offenses, including the damage that they've caused to a victim, the amount of violence used, any responsibility for their offenses, and planning of the offenses. So some will deny all or part of their offenses. So partial denial would include refuting that they have a problem, or refusal to accept that what they actually did was sexual abuse. Some researchers find denial is not an accurate predictor of recidivism, but there is some decent literature that says otherwise. Few therapists will allow anyone who has denied this to participate in treatment, and some will claim that they're falsely accused. Some minimize the damage caused. It wasn't a violent assault. It was consensual. It was a product of a mutual sexual interest or an affair. Sex offenders that have adult victims tend to minimize the damage they cause, so they might not recognize the level of violence used, or they express a distorted thought of sexual entitlement. They believe that they have a right to sexual intercourse. Justifications are ways that people acknowledge their guilt but don't take responsibility, instead choosing to justify their behavior. And they may blame the victim or justify their behavior through the victim's actions. So let's look at each of these. Oh, well, I don't have each of these. But they include the woman as seductress. Women mean yes when they say no. Most women eventually relax and enjoy it. Nice girls don't get raped, and what they did was only a minor wrongdoing. So if you think about number 5, only a minor wrongdoing, we see this in the Brock Turner case, where his father said publicly that his son is being punished for what amounted to 20 minutes of nonsense, or something to that effect. With children as child victims, these sex offenders often justify by saying they're helping the child learn about sex and that sex education is good for the child. They may say that the child enjoys it and that there's no harm being done to them. They may also say that the child initiated the sexual contact or that the child acts older than she or he actually is. Many children respond to the abusers by copying their actions or doing what they're told. And so the sex offender will often interpret this compliance as indicative of a child's enjoyment. Many children also do not exert physical resistance, and this is largely due to those grooming techniques. Unfortunately, sex offenders interpret this as the child enjoying the interaction and any natural biological reaction a victim might have, and victims do have natural biological reactions that may reinforce these ideas in the mind of the sex offender. Most child sexual abusers seek out vulnerable children, children who are abused physically, emotionally, or sexually, who desire attention. They may believe that they're showing this child love as no one else does. And they also have a tendency to misread social cues. So they don't identify anger and fear, and they don't understand pro-social boundaries for sexual contact. They misread cues from children in several ways. First of all, children are naturally affectionate, right? They'll hug people, they'll sit on someone's lap, and so they might also then perceive any sexual curiosity by a child as a desire to know about sex and therefore want to teach the child. And the better they know the victim, the more likely this is to happen. So what happens then is these misperceptions, as these sex offenders misread these cues, it reinforces their narcissistic beliefs and detracts from their ability to feel any empathy for their victim. In terms of victim empathy, all individuals interpret situations differently, and they construct theories about their world in order to explain how reality relates to them. And so think about, again, socially constructed realities of sex, and they revolve around two concepts: desires and beliefs. So they form mental constructs about what they believe the victim wants, and because they're generally narcissistic, they believe the victim desires sex with them. When they don't understand the impact of their behavior, they're unlikely to stop offending. So empathy is when we understand another person's feelings and emotions, and this develops during childhood. Research looking at this has found mixed results, ranging from showing no empathy to a lack of victim-specific empathy. So we don't really have a research consensus on this topic. Child sexual abusers do have a narcissistic view of their power, and this basically has to do with how they see the importance of their desire relative to those from a child. Rapists also often develop feelings of sexual entitlement at a younger age, and that's even more profound if the victim is someone who's viewed as promiscuous. They might believe or start to treat that victim like their property. Researchers have assumed that sex offenders have deviant sexual fantasies, and that those fantasies are what motivate them to then engage in this deviant sexual behavior. And they often believe that these are conditioned through masturbation, and therefore can be modified through deconditioning or aversion therapy. But we don't really have much evidence that supports the idea that sex offenders have more fantasies than non-sex offenders, or that their fantasies are more deviant. The prevalence and type of fantasies that offenders have is going to vary by offender and vary based on their offending behavior. So how do we measure this? Well, one thing we can do is we can use self-report. Okay, so we can do this through therapy, or we can do this through research tools where we would ask offenders about this. But many offenders deny they have fantasies or that their fantasies are deviant. Another thing they do is they use this thing called a PPG, a penile plasmidograph. And what this does is it gauges the circumference of the penis. And studies here show that deviant sexual interest is a significant problem for extrafamilial, outside the family, child sex abusers. But the problem is we don't know what the causal order here is. Does the fantasy precede the offending, or does offending lead to fantasy? We also know that people will experience behavioral triggers. There are certain situations that trigger them and make them more likely to engage in offending. Many will blame their offending on things like drugs, alcohol, stress, and loneliness. And also some of this behavior can act as a disinhibitor, with alcohol being the most common disinhibitor. Basically allows the offender to justify the behavior by saying, oh, I was in an altered mental state. These triggers can also act as potentiators. So a negative affective state such as depression could be a catalyst for deviant sexual behavior. And that wraps up this chapter.